So I am Matt Strickland, and I work for the Aquatic Inventories project. We are based out of the Corvallis Research Lab. I work for it. The project falls under the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. We fall in the department's fish division, which means we're a non-regulatory portion of ODFW. We focus primarily with research and monitoring. And so today I'm gonna try to break this talk into several parts. Let's see if this works. And the first part is going to be kind of a background about the Aquatic Inventories project and what we collect and what we are looking to do as we move forward into the future. And then I'm also going to talk about what role, I'll talk about a little background about the Oregon plan and what role the Oregon plan, what role the Aquatic Inventories plays in that Oregon plan, and specifically as it pertains to the monitoring portion of the Oregon plan, and more specifically as it pertains to coast coho salmon and how they are federally listed and how the data we collect helps inform federal managers on the current status. But the last part I'm going to talk about, and it was in the last screen, is probably a lot more interesting to all of you. And that's some of the information we collect, you can also collect, whether you're out for a hike or paddling a lake, whatever it may be, or a river. There's a lot of information we collect that you can also collect and share with national resource agencies and folks that can help us make management decisions. So if you were to ask, I think if you were to ask just about anybody who's familiar with the Aquatic Inventories project, and you could ask them to summarize what we do in one sentence, they'd say, oh, those guys, they conduct stream habitat surveys throughout the state of Oregon. And that'd be true. We have used the same habitat protocol to conduct stream habitat surveys throughout the state of Oregon since 1990. We use the same methods over that entire time, and they're developed by researchers at Oregon State University. The surveys we do were meant for wadable streams. And when I say wadable streams, I mean like small headwater streams that if you were on those streams, you'd be able to walk up them with ease. You could cross them. You could see everything that's in the creek. And so those are primarily the areas we've been sampling since 1990. When we survey in those, we use what is commonly thought of as a unit scale habitat data collection method. So, and when I say that, I mean, if you were to look at a stream, even if you're driving up a river and you looked over and went, hey, that's a really cool swimming hole over there, you would be doing a habitat survey. You'd be identifying a pool feature. So those habitat units we call out are just habitat features that are thought of as like pools, riffles, rapids, things like that. And within the bounds of each of those, we describe the physical features within those habitat units. So within individual pools, within riffles, within rapids. So we take dimensions and we describe things like substrate and roughness features and overhead canopy, riparian features. And then along with those habitat surveys, we survey at kind of two spatial scales. One is outside the distribution of anadromous fish, so salmon and steelhead fish that go to the ocean. And one reason we survey in these areas that are outside salmon and steelhead habitat is to look for, one, what is there? So there could be cutthroat or other resident fish like bull trout that you see in the lower left-hand portion of your screen. And also, when we survey these streams, we're not always correct in assuming that we're outside that distribution of salmon and steelhead habitat. We're always looking to see if our assumptions are correct or not. So there are times when we find things like steelhead, juvenile steelhead in these headwater streams, like you see in the upper right-hand corner. So yeah, we survey at these two spatial scales. One is outside the distribution, and then the other is we survey within the known distribution of what we think is within distribution of. Okay, so as we do these surveys, we don't just look in the creek itself or the stream itself. We also look at the riparian around the stream, and we describe the type of riparian and the type of geomorphic features like if there's a hill slope or a terrace, and the type of land use associated with each of these creeks. This is important for looking at how stream interaction within the floodplain and also the existing land use. An easy way to think about this, or a nicer way to think about this, is if you're doing a habitat survey, the first part of that survey that we do is within the stream itself, where we describe those individual habitat features like pools and riffles, and then how features directly influence the habitat, that stream habitat. And then at portions throughout the survey, we also look at floodplain interaction and how that stream interacts with the floodplain and how riparian is associated with that floodplain. And then as we get outside that throughout the survey, we also look at that land, that hill slope interaction, terrace interaction, and the overall land use interaction. So really the surveyors we have out there, they aren't just focused on a creek, they're really ecosystem, they're looking at the entire ecosystem, the entire watershed. And the most important thing I think that we do, and maybe some of you have streams running through your backyard, is that we're a liaison between ODFW and the general public. There's a lot of folks out there who have a creek running through their backyard that may have never known what was in that creek, and we're the only folks that have come along and say, hey, you know what, we saw a trout in the creek, and we saw steelhead, and this is pretty good habitat. We've also been able to spark a lot of interest in restoration, in backyard restoration, removal of exotic plant species, things of that sort. And then also we have a lot of landowners that we've worked with that have a lot more knowledge than us. They may be multi-generation Oregonians that have streams running through their backyard that they've known their entire life. And they know far more about those streams than we do, and the life history of fish and the fish that have been there. And that information is critically important to ODFW and other agencies as far as knowing what was there historically and how is that historical context mesh with today. So the information we collect is used, and the reason we collect it is to develop baseline information for a lot of these streams. A lot of streams, this is the first time anybody surveyed it, so we don't have a lot of information as far as what the habitat quality is like, or how that habitat quality interacts with how the fish interact with that habitat, or the overall fish assemblage. We also have sites we survey multiple times over a long time period, and with that longer time period, we're able to get a trend of the overall habitat through time and what sort of fish species are there, or the overall fish assemblage. So I kind of talked about how we survey two spatial scales: outside distribution of salmon and steelhead, and then within. And then we have two kind of survey types we focus on. One is what we would describe as basin scale surveys. And these are the surveys we've been doing since 1990. And the blue lines on this map indicate the surveys that we have, the streams we have surveyed, and the extent to which we've surveyed since 1990. These are surveys that, if you think of a stream as having a confluence someplace, and in the headwaters, we start that confluence and then we survey all the way to the headwaters. Most of these we do are on a contract basis through the Forest Service or through the Bureau of Land Management. And then more recently, we've had several more consistent type contracts we've done. One is with Portland General Electric, doing surveys in association with their Pelton Round Butte complex on the Deschutes River. So we've been surveying for historic steelhead habitat, sockeye habitat, and spring Chinook salmon habitat on the Deschutes River, the Crooked River Basin, and the Metolius Basin. And then in the last couple of years, we've been doing surveys for the city of Portland as they've been looking at streams that are within the city limits, looking at restoration potential there and fish habitat, as well as some wastewater runoff issues they've had and how to mitigate those. And then we also usually work with a small watershed council on a yearly basis. Last year, we worked with the Curry Watershed Partnership doing surveys on the Elk River in Southwest Oregon. This year, we'll be working with the Powder River Watershed Council, helping them get some surveys done. And we also have a survey out of the Elkton area on the Umpqua. A lot of times We do these surveys on a very small contract, and it's mostly to help these folks because they may have a grant through the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and they need monitoring done or a habitat surveying done before they start a restoration project, so they know what's there and they can look at pre and post restoration effectiveness, how they change the habitat through restoration. A lot of the work we do is just to provide in-kind match for those grants. And then the other surveys we do are in association with the Oregon Plan. And the Oregon Plan was developed in response, directly in response to the listing of coastal coho salmon. They were listed as threatened in the mid-90s, and by 1998, we had started initiating a monitoring program for that listing. And we also, I mean, we didn't just focus on coho at that point. We at least had the foresight to start thinking about not just coho, but Chinook salmon and steelhead as well. And we're starting to incorporate some cutthroat work now, some coastal cutthroat work. The portion the Aquatic Inventories plays in that are the aquatic habitat surveys and the juvenile rearing surveys. So we share these survey sites with also the adult monitoring projects. So they go out in the fall, they're the ones doing spawning surveys, looking at the number of adults that are out there. We have a 27-year sampling design associated with this. So we're actually coming up towards the end of the overall Oregon Plan, at least the monitoring portion of it. And now we're starting to think forward, what's next and where do we move on next that needs sampling. This gives you an idea of what we've sampled through time so far. This is just us. This is just the habitat project. This isn't the spawning project as well. So the way the design of this project works is we have sites we survey on an annual basis. Some sites we survey once every 3 years, some sites once every 9 years, and then we have sites we pull, we do every year, but we only do them once. We survey not just in the Oregon coast, but also in the Lower Columbia and in what is known as the Southern Oregon, Northern California evolutionary significant unit. So we survey a huge area. The Oregon coast portion that we survey is from essentially seaside, so the Nicanticum Basin, south to the Sixes River near Cape Blanco. The Lower Columbia portion that we survey is from Hood River west to Astoria, and then the Southern Oregon portion of that Southern Oregon, Northern California coast ESU is pretty big. We survey all the Rogue portion of it, the Elk River, Chetco, Winchuck, all those Southern Oregon, Southwest Oregon coastal rivers. So it's a pretty big area. We generally try to survey about 450 unique sites per year. So we have crews all over the place. And we at this point, we've seen most of Oregon, and we have a pretty good idea of what streams are like throughout Oregon. Now, the part we survey for the Oregon Plan, one of the main emphasis of our surveys goes towards describing habitat quality for coho salmon. And we use a model to take the habitat information we collect to give us a description, a qualitative description on what that habitat has, the ability that habitat has to support for juvenile coho salmon. So we use what's called the habitat limiting factors model. And what it does, it takes habitat features and we run those habitat features through the model, and the model can tell us the capacity that habitat has to support juvenile coho. It's not what is actually there as far as juvenile coho, but it's more like, it's like a habitat quality measure. So when we run those data through the model, and if the model suggests the habitat has the capacity to support more than 1,850 coho per kilometer, we consider that high quality habitat. If the model says the habitat could support less than 900 coho per kilometer, we consider that low quality habitat. The emphasis on this model is really on slow water refuge habitat for during winter conditions. Juvenile coho salmon, the limiting factor for juvenile coho salmon survival is overwinter survival. So they need slow water refuge habitats like pools, is in particular lateral scour pools, so pools that scour against one bank and scour sediment to the other side of the bank. And then within those, pools that have some interaction with wood or wood jams. That gives velocity refuge, it gives cover, and it provides food input, nutrient input as well. Beaver ponds play a huge role in the model as well. Juvenile coho really like beaver ponds. They utilize them well as what we describe as alcoves. So refuge habitat that is laterally displaced from the main channel. So that's how we get it. Those are some of the primary model inputs that we're looking for out there. This is a pretty messy slide to look at if you're not really familiar with what we do or how we look at data. But the take home here is there are populations, river basins throughout the Oregon coast. And what we have been able to do is look at the quality of habitat within each of those and then describe them across the entire Oregon coast. The red lines indicate that those habitat quality thresholds that I described earlier. So the upper red line is anything above that is high quality habitat, and the lower red line, anything below that is low quality habitat. We have been able to survey all of these basins at an extent that gives us a pretty good idea of what's there. And from this, what I can say is across all habitats, across all populations on our coast, about 61% of the available habitat right now is of low quality habitat. About 23% is moderate quality, and about 16% is high quality. So what does this mean? It means for recovery purposes, if the hope is to recover coho salmon, and one of the primary listing criteria for recovering Oregon coast coho salmon is high quality habitat, we've got a ways to go. So what we can use these data to inform restoration practitioners, folks like watershed councils or restoration biologists that work for federal agencies or ODFW. We provide them with these data and then an idea of where they can focus their efforts to improve freshwater habitat in these rivers to hopefully be able to recover coho salmon. The overall hope of that is one day we can fish for them, and there's more nutrient input in the streams because we have more spawning fish. This is just a figure. It's a figure of basically what I just said, but what it does is shows the current high quality habitat for each one of those populations I described. So like the Alsea River, the Coos River, Coquille. And the current high quality habitat being kind of the orangish bars. And then what we have as the habitat we need to get to, the desired habitat in order to delist coho. So you can see we've got a long ways to go. We're not there, but we've got some areas we can focus on. And at least this gives us an idea of some of the bigger areas we need to focus, some of the populations we need to focus on, and then we know certain habitats we can focus on within those. So to this point, that's what we have used these data to provide, is give us an idea of where we need to work on restoration and who to provide these data with. So we're on year 22 of the 27 years of the Oregon Plan. We've been sampling these small headwater streams, but the one thing we haven't done is sample larger rivers. So that's an obvious place to move on to next, particularly when you think about where are fish utilizing these habitats. And if we're just describing habitat in terms of what's high quality out there, we've missed a large portion that's there by not surveying these larger rivers. The reason we haven't surveyed is because honestly, our current, the protocol we use, the methods we use aren't appropriate for describing habitat in places where you can't see the habitat. So a large river where you can't see the bottom, our methods aren't really made for that. So we're looking at developing methods that are appropriate for larger river systems. And this may seem silly, but one of the first hurdles we ran up against is where do we survey? Because that's the starting point, is where are our methods going to be considered useful or appropriate? So I looked at some other folks, some other agencies who have done these large river surveys. One, the obvious starting point was the Environmental Protection Agency's EMAP program. They have a program where they survey rivers and streams across the United States. And they have a weightable component, so a small stream component, and they also have a large river component. So I looked at their methods and I said, okay, how'd they define these? And they said they defined a large river where they do their large river surveys as those where it would require a boat to survey. That's not very helpful for making a clear line in the sand. And so later on, they talked about stream order. And when I talk about stream order from here on out, generally, the higher the number means the bigger the stream, the lower the number, the smaller stream. So a first order stream would be a tiny little headwater stream. In order to make it a second order stream, you need two first order streams to come together at a confluence. Below that, you'll have a second order stream. So what I have shown here on the screen are what they essentially said were their non-wadable or big river areas for survey, larger than fifth order. So these are 6 order streams in Oregon. When I first saw this, I was ecstatic. I thought, this is great. I'm going to sign up for this. This is going to be my career from here on out, is floating the John Day, the Deschutes and Crooked, the Oahe, the Lower Grand Ronde. I can't think of any better way to spend my summers. But it's not very descriptive of the habitat across Oregon, and it leaves a lot out that would still be inappropriate for our wadable methods, because we still need to be able to sample everything. So if I looked at fifth order streams and larger, yeah, we got streams like the Santiams and the Mackenzies, and some of the coastal streams, coastal rivers like the Silettes, but it still left a lot out that right now we have folks out there that have already described certain habitats or certain streams that they described as not being wadable. So I used some of our existing notes in place to look at fourth order and larger. And we kind of made a line in the sand saying, from here on out, we're going to survey first through third order streams using the wadable protocol that we've used since 1990. In fourth order and larger, which includes most of the Oregon rivers and streams you'd be familiar with, we would just use those from here on out using non-wadable methods. So this becomes our non-wadable habitat. And we needed some places to test the methods we were working on. And the first couple places we wanted to look at, we wanted places that were very distinctly different from each other so that they were representative of habitat across the state of Oregon. So we started off with the Silettes River and the Columbia Slough, 2 very different places. In the Silettes in 2018, we used kind of existing protocols that were in place that we use for our wadable methods. And we went out there using boats to get almost the entire non-wadable portion of the Silettes. So we floated the entire Silettes, and we used ocular observations because we surveyed at summer base flow conditions, and at summer base flow conditions on most Oregon coastal rivers, you can see just about everything. And so we were able to describe habitat in a way that was very similar to what we had been doing with our wadable methods. It took us about a month's worth of survey time and effort, 1 survey crew to cover 41 miles. That's really pretty good there. We were moving right along. And we were able to describe and summarize information to the reach scale. And when I say a reach scale from here on out, what that means is it's a segment of stream that is unique to the next segment of stream. So you may have a large tributary on a stream, and we may break that as a reach. But the obvious example would be if you're walking through a creek in a park where you have it's just a park that won't be changed over time. And once you leave that park, you're in rural residential area. That would be a different reach. So the area within the park is 1 reach. So in the Silettes, we were able to describe 7 individual reaches and summarize the information to those individual reaches. This is basically what we do with our wadable surveys. We were able to describe habitat in a way that could say, this is good spawning habitat, and this area is better spawning habitat than the next area or that area, and there are areas that are better for juvenile salmoniid rearing. This worked really well for us. I mean, because we compare these areas to headwater, some of these headwater areas, and the whole purpose of this is to be able to look across an entire watershed and get an idea of what the habitat quality is like. The issue you run up against is not all habitats like this, and you're not going to be able to see into all the habitat. And even across seasons, not all habitats like that. If you're familiar with a river in the summer, you may be able to walk across it, but in the winter, it may be huge. We want to be able to survey across all seasons. So the first thing we started looking at was using a side scan sonar. And I don't know if everyone here is familiar with what a side scan sonar is, but it's essentially kind of like a fish finder, where it shows you the bottom, but it lays it out a little bit differently. It lays it out kind of like a floor would be laid out. So if you look at the bottom, it just lays it out flat. Some folks had already been using this to map habitat in other parts of the country. And so we knew it worked. We just didn't know if it would work here. We were the first ones to really try it in Oregon on our streams. And this is what, this is essentially the components of a side scan sonar. You have a screen that gives you information on what you see, and then a transducer head that we mounted with some PVC and an old Minn Kota trolling motor bracket we had. So we went back over the same exact area we did the summer before using those whale well methods. Now we went in and we used exclusively the sonar, and we surveyed those same 41 miles in 5 survey days. The purpose of this initially was to just see if we could describe individual substrate types. So if you look at the bottom of a stream, you'll see pebbles and boulders and cobbles. We break those into things like fines. So that's sand and silt, and then the amount of gravel, cobble, boulder, and then bedrock. We wanted to see if we could use that side scan sonar imagery to get similar results from what we had from our ocular observations the summer before. So what we did is we took the boundaries of those individual habitat units, those pools and those ripples, we mapped them, the start and end points, and then within each one of those, so then we also laid down the sonar imagery on top of that. So we had the boundaries and we had the sonar imagery. And then within each one of those boundaries, we created 10 transect lines. And on each transect line, we had 10 substrate points. So essentially you get 100 substrate grabs for each habitat unit, each individual substrate point representing 1% of substrate. And so each one of the substrate points, we would describe what the dominant substrate was around it. Really, really boring stuff. I totally get it. There's a thing called a Woolman pebble count we do to verify what you see out there by literally doing this on a stream and then reaching down and making 100 substrate grabs. It's awful. Nobody likes it. But now we made it even worse by doing it on a computer screen all day long. That much more boring. But it's one of those things you have to do because it's kind of like, it's like a known method and you know what you're seeing at that point. So we wanted to use these compared to those summer ocular estimates to see if we had similar results. If we can get similar results, we can use the side scan sonar to be a lot more efficient with our time and cover a lot more area. We're going to summarize these results to the reach scale just like we did with the ocular estimates. And I use this, what's called a simple linear regression to make this assessment. The results were awesome. When you look at these are adjusted R-square values. The closer you are to 1, the more precision essentially you have. So the better your results are. These are, especially for the sand and silt, gravel, and bedrock, the precision here is awesome. We are, with the side scan sonar, we're able to see what we see with, get the same results as we'd get with our ocular estimation. Even the cobble, those are very acceptable and good result. And even the boulder really isn't that bad. I would like to see it better because I like higher precision. I want to know we're getting better results. But I think when you see that, those actually aren't the worst results because, at least when I've floated the sleds and looked at the substrate, the boulder and the cobble are a very similar size. So just trying to make a description between the two, I think we're identifying what's there. We may have just called some things boulder that were actually cobble and some things cobble that are actually boulder. I think as we move forward to be more accurate with this, we need to think in terms of what is available adult salmon and steelhead spawning habitats. So we'll adjust those size classes a little bit, and I think our results will actually be better because of it. So then from there, we moved on to the Columbia Slough. We moved out of the nice, clean, pristine Sluts River, and we moved on to the Columbia Slough. The Columbia Slough is a slough. There are no distinct habitat units. We cannot describe and make a distinction of habitat types. So we had to use the sonar exclusively. We were still able to describe distinct reaches. We used this through remote sensing, so through things like Google Earth. And we were able to survey 22 miles of this. We used, like I said, we used exclusively the side scan sonar. So through that, we can get things like water column depth. As you see on there, that's how we measure water column depth. The arrows, the up and down arrows indicate that, and then you can just use a measure tool and it gives you what the depth was. And we can also get channel width. So the A and the B there represents how you get channel width. So we can get channel dimensions just using the side scan sonar. And in addition to already knowing that we can get individual substrate types, we were also able to identify roughness features like large wood, or in this case, bridge abutments, and the occasional carp. We saw quite a bit of that in the slough, as well as a fair amount of shopping carts and barrels. So those 22 miles took us 5 days to complete. You know, the crew doesn't like it when I put that up there because I think, you know, they think they could have done better. I know that they think they could have gone a lot faster, but I was not the best in my organization with this, and I had them drive every day out of Corvallis to Portland to do these surveys and then back. And so they were leaving at 7 o'clock in the morning, getting rush hour traffic, getting the boat in the water, and then trying to be back here by 5. So they're hitting rush hour both ways. And they still only took 5 days to get this work done. I think they did a really good job. We were using the sonar, we were able to describe information at the reach level and get an idea of what's available, at least in terms of for restoration potential in the future. So we felt really good about where we're at right now using just the side scan sonar. So we, you know, our accomplishments in just the last couple of years in developing this large river protocol is that we've been able to describe habitats using some of our existing methods and also the side scan sonar, which is pretty cool. And it's pretty novel for its use here in Oregon, and especially in these, the river types we have here. So what has 2020 been like so far as we moved into 2020? That same crew's been out doing surveys now. And one of the focuses we've had early on now is creating a key for sonar substrate identification. So remember how boulder and cobble didn't produce as precise results as the other substrate types. Well, one thing we can do is create a key. So we can go over known areas where you can see the substrate, run the sonar over that, over a known area by length and width, and then we can identify exactly what that substrate is, a small area. And it creates kind of like an identification key for people to use. The other really cool thing about this is with some of the models that we have available to us now, we can take those keys, input them into a model, and the model will tell us what what substrate is on from the sonar imagery. So the eventual goal, the more precise we are with our results and knowing what substrates are there, is we can input just the sonar imagery in eventually and get those results back without having to do any actual time in front of the computer where you're trying to describe the habitat by hand off the imagery. We should be able to do all this through models relatively soon. So in addition to that, the crew has also been working on what is called the Clackamas River Focused Investment Partnership. There's a lot of restoration work going into lower Clackamas River below River Mill Dam. So basically between Estacada and the confluence with the Willamette River, there is a at least 10-year project going on to restore side channels and habitat complexity within the Salmon River in order to provide adult salmon spawning habitat and juvenile rearing. We have been contracted to use our methods to get baseline information and then look at how the habitat changes through time with restoration projects. So we started that this year, and that's where we're moving on, at least for the next several years, is putting a lot of our focus on this. And I want to mention the crew now. I mean, they've dealt with a lot this year. They were kind of they started in February, right around the time the COVID crisis started. And they have done a really good job of following social distancing guidelines and still getting the work done, and working around a lot of obstacles like state park closures. We worked within Milo MacGyver State Park, and it was closed and they had to get a work around that and get exemption, and then same with county parks. So it's been kind of a rough field season for them, but they've persevered and got things done. And tomorrow is their last day of the field season, so sad to see them go, but they've done an awesome job for me this year. As we move into the future with this large river stuff, we also need to incorporate a fish sampling component. So like in the wadable streams right now, we use electrofishing and snorkel surveys. Both those might not work that great in these large river systems. We might be able to do some snorkel surveys to get at least a fish assemblage idea. So what's there, presence, absence. Electrofishing, we'll run up against permitting issues especially with the federal folks, because there could be adult fish there. And when we use electrical current, the larger the body size, the more electrical current it takes, they don't handle it well. So we probably should be doing electrofishing where there's adult fish potentially present. So we have to think about that, how we're going to do some fish sampling stuff. We also need to think about how we're going to develop and describe some models like we do. I talked about the habitat limiting factors model, habitat limiting factors model, where we can describe habitat quality and like high quality habitat for coho. We need to kind of develop something similar for these large river systems. And then we'll continue to think about new technology. Sonar isn't the only answer. We've started actually incorporating some drone work into these surveys as well. There's plenty of remote sensing work through LiDAR and other things, but we've got a lot of ideas out there for making things a little more efficient for us. And then the next big step for us is trying to figure out how we're going to basically describe wood jams on the sonar. And I'll kind of give you an example of one of the issues we run up against there. It's pretty easy to describe individual pieces of wood through the sonar. You can see them on the sonar pretty well, like you would with your naked eye. And we can take that, we can see those, and then we can just use an easy measuring tool. The issue we run up against are wood jams. So when we do our wadable surveys, we actually measure out each individual piece within that wood jam, or at least where you can see them. And from that, you can get a pretty good idea of the number of pieces and overall wood volume. And this plays into some of those models we use pretty heavily. But if those are underwater and we use the sonar, what you get is a shadow effect, because the sonar, the beam that transmits can only get the front side of that, and the back side of that wood jam basically gets shadowed out and we can't see it. So what we need to do is figure out, as we go over these, we need to see wood jams we can actually see with our eyes and we can measure, and then wood jams and then we'll go back over those with the sonar and take measurements and see how accurate we can get with using just some basic geometry to see if we can get volume off those basic measurements. So that's kind of one of the next steps, and which means I need to go back to geometry and hopefully get better to see this time. Now, this is the part of the talk I think should be of interest to most of you. And this is the part where there's a lot of other information out there we collect. What I just kind of gave you, the talk there was what we do and how we use major portions of the data and how other agencies rely on our data for a lot of heavy management decisions. The next part is a lot of the more of the fun stuff where agencies use this information for distribution work and trying to do it for restoration purposes. So one of the things we can all get involved with is the Xerces Society. It's a society for invertebrates, and one of those is freshwater mussels. And I'm by no means an expert on freshwater mussels, but I've become far more interested in the last couple of years. The more and more I learn about them and the role they play. So we've got several freshwater mussels, native freshwater mussels here in Oregon. The one you probably most commonly see if you've been on some larger rivers is the Western pearl shell. That's the one where if you see a mussel shell laying on the bank of the river, it's the one that when you flip it over, so it's dark on one side, you flip it over to the other side, it has that pearly look to it, and it's pretty big. That's a Western pearl shell. We've also got some Western ridge mussels, some Oregon floaters, and California floaters. I recommend everybody, if you're interested in this stuff, to pick up the Freshwater Mussel Guide of the Pacific Northwest. It helps a lot with seeing what's there. And then also, if you see some of these, get in contact with the Xerces Society and tell them where you saw, especially if you see mussel beds. That's something they're always really interested in. And they're not always easy to see. It takes a while to see these and kind of figure out how to look for them. But that's just one of those cool things we do out there is we actually look for mussels. We also look for amphibians. There's a lot of amphibians that are of importance for the Oregon conservation strategy, as well as just knowing general distribution, and also non-native and exotic influence and where those are starting to expand to. Things like bullfrogs. That's a non-native exotic species that has expanded and is taking over habitat of species like the one you can see right here, the red-legged frog. Bullfrogs outcompete red-legged frogs for habitat. We also have some species that are in pretty bad shape. One is the Oregon spotted frog. I've worked on projects looking at those. Pretty cool frog, but they're in very specific small areas now due to habitat degradation, overall loss of habitat. So if you see those outside some of their known range, that's something that's really important for folks, especially the USGS, who's doing most of the work on those. Again, the best way to kind of get involved with amphibians and knowing what you're seeing is to pick up an amphibian guidebook. Be amazed at how many we have out there. We do a lot of work with beaver and looking at beaver habitat as well. They're not just important for us for looking at fish habitat, but OSU is really interested in them. What's amazing is, beavers are kind of an iconic species here, but we really don't know much about beaver biology in the Northwest. Most of the beaver work that has been done and beaver research that's been done in
and it looks like we've lost Matt. So, all right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this meeting this evening. I will contact Matt and tell him that we really appreciate him being here. He may be calling me in a minute. We were originally planning on doing some question and answer after Matt had finished his presentation, but if he's not there, I'm going to have a hard time giving you answers. I'd like to thank you all for joining our meeting tonight, and we will we will see you again soon.